welcome back to the State of the World series, this one on the First Tib War, a reconstruction of my first video on it. Near the beginning of my channel, I started a mini-series I intended to continue, and thought I remembered going a lot farther than I did with just that one video, the State of the World series, in which I go over the state of the world in different periods of the wars in first Tiberium series, and then I would do the Red Alert series, which I wanted to do next. In the first one, I looked over the world as it was in and around the first Tiberium War, and while I think I did a decent job for the time, I would like to tackle that again. So, here is the state of the world pre-First Tiberium War. In the video in which I go into the perception of Cain before the First Tiberium War, I go into a lot of details around what would have needed to happen for the world to exist in which Cain could launch his devastating wars of conquest and enlightenment. And while I suggest you go back and watch that video for a lot of the details on the events that I go on over there, I will go over bits of it today as well for the sake of fully covering everything. One of the things that CNC is a alternate history series. The point of divergence is different for every game. For Red Alert, that is Einstein and the death of the Mustache Man. And for Generals, it seems to be the emergence of GLA in the 21st century, although that one is a lot more vague. For Tiberium, it is the emergence of Cain, though given how far back Cain has existed, or at least is implied to have existed, as he is shown in Renegade on an ancient mural that is potentially real, is up for debate. The mural in Cairo temple is likely thousands of years old, as many of the tombs in that area are from around Khufu's time, placing him as far back as 2600 BC, although he states that he has been with us as far back as when humans were living in mud huts and caves, suggesting that he has been around us since deep into prehistory. For the purpose of this discussion, however, and to keep ourselves sane, we will consider the point of divergence to be a time not long after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Cain first reveals himself. It is very likely that Cain, as is implied by his presence in the separate but related universe of Red Alert, that Cain had a hand in the end of the Soviet Union, and given the name of his organization, the Black Hand, that he may have helped to instigate World War II. But his greatest and most easily seen impact is after the collapse. Generally, the history of the world in the Command & Conquer Tiberium universe is the same as ours until he shows up. As we can surmise from the fact that generally speaking, all the countries that exist in 1995 still do, and borders are pretty similar. Weapon systems are similar as well, and countries still use the same iconography. Cain, when revealing himself in the last decade of the 20th century, was already known to large sections of the world as the mysterious leader of a new religious movement. To the Christians, he was known as Jacob Cain. To the Muslims, Amir al-Qaim. And everywhere there was a strong religious majority, his words were taken very seriously. The 20th century was a century of change for large parts of the world, where monarchies were putting down their scepters and taking up the mantles of democracies, and the last of the theocracies became at least nominally secular. In 1924, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved and the Turkish Republic was instituted, and with it the abolishment of the title of Caliph from what would be the last, at least in our world-recognized caliphate. The State of Israel was established, and the last of the fascist states were wiped away. What were once absolute monarchies became republics, or parliamentary democracies. Their once all-powerful leaders largely made ceremonial. And with the fall of the last great evil in the 20th century, at least in the minds of the West during the latter days of the 20th century, the Soviets, the future of the 21st century could only look hopeful. Unfortunately, in this universe, Cain existed, so not all went to plan. It began in the most religious parts of the world, mostly centered around the realms of the Abrahamic religions, Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, but also touched parts of Central and South America, and small parts of Asia. Everywhere, the voice of a mysterious figure known by variations of the name of the man who was the first to commit a murder spoke about the coming of a divine material from the heavens, and the new prophet of God Almighty. His theology is unclear, but enough people are convinced that by the end of the time of the establishment of the Russian Republic, after the Soviets' exit, all major countries in the UN knew the name of this individual. He heralded the fall of the Tiberium meteor and began in secret the process of spreading it across the planet. In real life, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the economists of the West entered into a partnership with the Russian state actors to revamp their economy after decades of communist planned economy thinking. This resulted in a rapid development and recovery of their economy, but also led to many industry leaders there acquiring vast amounts of power, leading to the problem of the oligarchs that exist today. In this world, however, by the time of the development of GDI, Russia is in the UN countries that make up the charter to form GDI, which has likely to do with a shift in attitude that the West takes in the redevelopment of Russia due to Keynes' influence and the influence of Tiberium and Tiberium harvesting technologies. Russia is a union of various smaller republics that are each comprised of many different peoples and former nations absorbed by the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, and many of these people were on the list to be targeted by Keynes and his machinations. Large sections of Russia are Orthodox Christian, and another large portion are Muslim, and Russia borders on many Muslim nations. These facts are very important to the development of the world we see in Tiberium, as there are organizational, military, religious, and industrial impacts to the country from Keynes' initial actions. The first thing I would like to talk about here is that most of Nod's arsenal of nuclear weapons likely came from Soviet stockpiles, as the West would be much less likely to lose theirs compared to the dissolving Union. In real life, there was a very good reason the United States and her NATO allies didn't occupy Russia after the fall, and that was because they were worried about the potential radicals in the military or from other groups to raid nuclear stockpiles in the event that a military presence was introduced, and for ISIS types to smuggle nuclear weapons to New York, London, or Paris. But with Soviet member states breaking off one by one and much of these territories bordering or being occupied by not-affiliated populations, the worst likely did happen. The loss of these weapons, a key bargaining chip that the Russians used IRL to do things like negotiate with Ukraine and their NATO neighbors, likely led Russia to be far more involved with the politics of Western Europe, as they floundered both for safety and relevancy post-dissolution. Another factor is the spread of Tiberium and the development of mining technologies. Tiberium wasn't initially seen as dangerous by many governments around the world, and indeed may not have been dangerous in its initial versions, which is suggested by the implied length of time it takes from when Tib lands to the first real wave of fatalities from its radiation. The West and Russia in this time period are defined by their relationship to the material and the newly opened markets from former Soviet countries. One thing that doesn't get brought up a lot, since Russia really isn't featured in a lot of the games, is Russia is probably one of the most resource-rich places in the world, covered in large parts by a permafrost that prevents exploitation by people. However, Tiberium is not limited by temperature, as Tiberium existed in the depths of space where extreme temperatures and radiations abounded, so Siberia is no doubt covered in fields of green. Initially, this may have been a good thing, as industry of Tib refining brought endless resources out of inaccessible ground, but as Nod began to rise and the world began to inch closer to devastation, Russia had no choice but to join the alliance of nations to fight against Nod. The future for the people of Siberia and Russia proper is likely quite bleak in current-day Tib universe, as cold weather, ion storms, radiation from Tiberium nuclear strikes has caused an already repressed society to become even more so. Other parts of northern Europe were probably hit in similar ways, as low populations, deep wells of resources for Tib to tap, and proximity to a lot of the famous battles meant that they were hit hard as well, though not as hard as Russia, where the large size of the nation and the lack of people relative to the size made it worse. These places benefited from the relationship to G7 countries, and despite the harshness of the New World, they maintained themselves into blue zone status by the Third War era. Be happy, bad guy 292. Your snowy Denmark is not mired by Tiberium in this universe, though you may have been enlisted into the GDI military. Makes you wonder what the state of content producers is in this world. That aside, Europe as a whole suffers a tremendous amount over the course of the wars, but in the initial period benefited a tremendous amount from the growth of Tib and Tib refining tech. The fact that the area was already in a close-knit quasi-state set up in the EU helped a lot in getting streamlined standardization for the refinement tech, as a lot of discoveries were likely made there. Traditionally, at least from the colonial period, Europe was an extractive economy, but since the collapse of colonial empires, they had struggled to maintain their economies and relevance on the world stage, especially in the former Soviet areas. NATO, an institution now defunct because of the reintegration of Russia into the fold, was for a long time in real life not properly funded by European states, as they put the money that should have gone to mutual defense into their social safety net and welfare projects. This weakness led to a lot of problems in real life in recent years, but in game they have potential weaknesses in these places too. While the headquarters for GDI would be built in Europe, they are a combination of yellow and red zones in the present day, and part of the reason that happens is their relative lack of preparedness for the First War in comparison to the United States by GDP. But in the beginning, Tiberium was bringing seemingly endless resources from the ground, and the economies of Europe were filled with hope of regaining their once great status that they lost to a fledgling colony after World War II. Anti-colonial rhetoric sped by Keane began to force a braking motion in the recovery, however, and formerly hard-hit colonial parts of the world experienced the same resurgence as Tib was spread by Keane to other countries. The political firestorm caused by the rise of Keane and the development of the refinement tech was incredible and set the stage for a chaotic First War, where I am sure that GDI, as much as the war was terrible, and it was, could have been much worse, as places like China, India, South America, and other places could have also gotten involved if they had fallen for Nod's lure. Imagine if the First Tib War had been a true world war, where fighting happening in every corner of the globe. I suppose GDI High Command is simply relieved that Kane did not have the time before the war happened to ferment this, and that Kane's framing of GDI in the public eye failed. If it had succeeded, and the other place had risen up, or simply blocked the development of GDI, then the war against Nod would have been uncoordinated and chaotic, and likely would have failed. Overall, the pre-war world was marked by the false promise of Tiberium, and drawn into chaos by a man with unworldly intelligence and ego, setting the stage for an eruption of violence never before seen in the history of mankind. By the end of the last war, there was likely only a fraction of the human race left, and a fraction less of the Earth's biomass remaining. Keep tuned for an upcoming video on the First Interregnum period, the state of the world before the Second Tiberium War, and probably soon another environmental impact of Tib video. At the end here, I want to thank everyone for watching and wish everyone a happy weekend and that all of their endeavors are successful. I hope to get another video out this next weekend, but we'll see. There are 10 months left in the year. Let's see how many videos I can get out. See you later. Bye.